In 1527, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca set off as part of the Narvàez Expedition to conquer Florida. The expedition ended in disaster. Cabeza de Vaca and 3 other men would spend the next 8 years wandering what is now the Southwestern United States. Come learn about their voyage on this episode of Footnoting History. Hey Footnoters, Josh here with quite the tale for you today. I'm sorry to say that this one's a bit shorter than usual, but I promise you're still going to have a good time. Except for maybe the cannibalism part, but no spoilers. I bring up one of my mentors, Matt Andrews at UNC Chapel Hill, a lot because he had such a profound impact on what I know about American history and how to teach and tell stories. Well, Matt's partially responsible for this episode too because he introduced me to Cabeza de Vaca. When I was getting ready to graduate with my PhD, I was TAing Matt's U.S. History to 1865 class. I knew that I'd soon be off to El Paso, and within a few weeks of arriving, I'd be teaching my own U.S. to 1877 class. Matt was very generous and gave me plenty of notes and materials, but he reminded me that I needed to make it fit my, new-to-me, local context. Sage advice, honestly. He told me that he didn't know much about the American Southwest, but there was this story that I absolutely had to look into, Cabeza de Vaca. Matt said that he'd recently read a book by the historian Andrés Reséndez, and that I had to check it out. Matt could have told me to stick my head in a hornet's nest, and I'd have listened and followed his advice. So I went and picked up a copy of Reséndez's A Land So Strange. Bibliographical information is in the episode notes. Friends, I'm not what you'd call a fast reader. I'm easily distracted. But when I got a copy of Reséndez's book, I sat down to read the first chapter one morning, and when I put the book down, it was sometime at night, and I had finished the book. It's good. A Land So Strange is kind of a novelization of the main primary source we have for Cabeza de Vaca called La Relación de Cabeza de Vaca, and somehow I managed to Frenchify that, so congrats to me. After his travels, Cabeza de Vaca wrote down all that he experienced. He had other sources to consult, including a report of the failed mission to Florida that sent the events in motion that saw him travel to what would become the Southwestern United States and northern Mexico. So who was this guy, and why should we be paying attention to him at all? Well, let's start with a little bit of biography. Namely his name. Wordplay. If you know Spanish, you know that cabeza translates to head in English, and that vaca means cow. The de, of course, is possessive. So, yes, translated to English, our dude's name is Cowhead. Who in their right mind would call themselves Cowhead? The answer is that we really don't know the origin of his name. There's an apocryphal story that one of Cabeza de Vaca's maternal great-grandfathers, Martín al-Aja, earned the name Cabeza de Vaca because he left a cow's head as a marker for a secret path that a Christian army could use to attack Spanish Muslims. Most historians do not believe this story to be true. Whatever the name's origin, our Cabeza de Vaca was born into a well-to-do Hidalgo family. So they were minor nobles, important but not really important, if that makes sense. In any case, Cabeza de Vaca followed in his grandfather's, Pedro de Vera, footsteps. A military man. After serving under a duke for the better part of 2 decades, Cabeza de Vaca was granted an appointment to serve as treasurer for the conquistador Panfilo de Narváez's Expedition. Narváez's expedition was set to explore what is now the southeastern United States, but didn't make it past Florida. And it wasn't because they got snatched up by some gators, crocodiles, or invasive Burmese pythons. Those weren't in Florida yet. Nor did Florida man visit his chaos among them. After stopping in Hispaniola, where Narváez lost a good number of his crew due to them just noping out, the expedition set off for Cuba. Cuba did not bring any reversal of fortune. A hurricane struck the island, sinking 2 of their ships, killing 60 men and 20 horses. When they finally did set off for Florida, the expedition got blown off course by yet another storm. When everything had settled and they finally spotted land, the Narvàez Expedition was somewhere near what is now Tampa Bay. Over the next several weeks, Narvàez and his expedition encountered, slaughtered, and pillaged many native villages. There was resistance, and slowly but surely, the Narvàez expedition's numbers began to thin. The expedition numbered around 240 when the decision was made to abandon Narvàez's goals of gold and fortune and to try to make it back to Mexico. The main issue facing these now marooned men was that they had lost their ships entirely. I don't know how you lose 5 whole ships, but these men did, and now they were stuck. Nevertheless, they persisted, and the men quickly moved to fashion new boats. Honestly, though, calling these makeshift watercraft boats would be an insult to boats. They also didn't really have shipbuilding tools, so they had to make them. The men fashioned a bellows out of deerskin and hollowed out wood, which they then used to melt down their stirrups, spurs, and other horse equipment to fashion the tools and parts that they needed. The expedition was off again, this time on 5 what we'll call rafts, with approximately 50 men on board each of them, and they followed the Gulf Coast to the west. Things were going well-ish until they reached the mouth of the Mississippi River. The current flowing out of the Mississippi pushed the rafts apart. Cabeza de Vaca's raft and one other landed on present-day Follett's Island, which is a bit to the southeast of the modern Texas city of Galveston. As an aside, Galveston's an interesting visit if you're ever down towards Houston. There's all kinds of cool history in that city, even if the beach is, let's say, unconventional. Oh, and there's a giant Buc-ee's between Galveston and Houston. So go get those beaver nuggets and pay homage to the great beaver of Texas. And now Colorado and Tennessee. Buc-ee's, please sponsor us. Once this motley group of Spaniards made landfall in Texas, things didn't get much better for them. It was wintertime, and while Galveston isn't Michigan's Upper Peninsula, being exposed for that long on an island with no shelter or reliable source of food is going to lead to some bad consequences. And it's not as if they could have put a bunch of provisions on the makeshift rafts anyway. So desperate times call for desperate measures. And to borrow a phrase from one of my favorite true crime podcasts, that's when the cannibalism started. There aren't a whole lot of details here. I'm sure that Cabeza de Vaca would have rather forgotten about this terrible episode in his life, but between the cannibalism and the disease that struck the castaways, only 13 survived the winter. Cabeza de Vaca himself had actually left the island, which he refers to as La Isla de Malhado, or the Isle of Misfortune. You could also translate that as the Isle of Doom, which I think is more fitting, honestly. Our cow-headed hero had made it over to the mainland where he fell sick. He survived because the local indigenous people, perhaps the Capoque, cared for him. Interestingly, the Capoque were deeply upset at seeing the cannibalism of the Spaniards, while at the same time, many of the Spanish were wary of any indigenous peoples because the Spanish believed any indigenous Americans to be cannibals. Like I think I mentioned in the Alfred Packer episode, it's really interesting that cannibalism is almost a universal threshold for inhumanity. Cabeza de Vaca did survive, though. Most of the Narvàez expedition had not. What started as nearly 300 men dwindled to 242, to 13 on the Island of Doom, and then only 4 survived. Cabeza de Vaca, Alonso de Castillo, Andres Dorantes de Carranza, and perhaps most interesting of all, an enslaved man named Estevanico. Estevanico may have been the first black person to ever step foot on what would become known as the Americas. I don't know if there's enough material on him to do an entire episode, but I'll look into it because this is a fascinating story. Cabeza de Vaca and the other 3 men became quote-unquote enslaved by several indigenous peoples. You can't see them, but maybe you could hear them. I put scare quotes around the word enslaved. Because of the tragic history of African slavery, when we say enslaved, especially in the United States, we tend to think of chattel slavery. But what these men experienced from the indigenous people of the Americas was not chattel slavery. Of course, Estevanico experienced chattel slavery, but the Spanish, namely Andres Dorantes de Carranza, had enslaved him, and Spanish slavery was chattel slavery. Now, to be clear about something, Cabeza de Vaca was on his own for a while. The other three men had left the island of Doom after the winter ended and were captured and enslaved by another group of indigenous peoples. For Cabeza de Vaca himself, his enslavement involved becoming a merchant, but he also developed a reputation as a healer. He would earn food by providing his services, which involved blowing on the bodies of the sick and injured and praying Catholic prayers over the patient. During his travels as a merchant and a healer, he encountered another group of indigenous people called the Cuevenes. These folks told Cabeza de Vaca that there were 3 Spaniards just like him somewhere nearby. Well, those 3 Spaniards were Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevanico. The 4 men eventually reunited and were enslaved again, this time by the Mariames people. They would work as hunters and gatherers, but longed to return to their countrymen in Mexico. In September of 1534, the 4 men made their escape, left separately, but somehow managed to find each other a few weeks later. They would later encounter the Álvarez people, with whom they stayed for 8 months. By Christmas 1535, the men had made their way back into Mexico and made it to Mexico City by July of 1536. They had journeyed an estimated 2,400 miles, all on foot. While Dorantes and Castillo retired from conquistadoring, that's not a real word, but stick with me, Cabeza de Vaca did not. He eventually was appointed as a governor in Paraguay. Things did not end up going well for Mr. Cowhead. He was eventually accused of 32 specific charges of mistreating natives, and was sentenced to 5 years in a penal colony in North Africa and banished from returning to the Americas. His sentence was commuted, however, and he lived the rest of his life in Spain. Estevanico, of course, was returned to a life of chattel slavery. Because of his experience traveling through Texas and Mexico, he was forced to guide an expedition that went ahead of Coronado's own travels in search of Cibola, one of the 7 mythical cities of gold. Spoiler, no place existed, and Coronado ended up in Kansas. Tough break. Sorry, Kansans. So what do we do with the story of Cabeza de Vaca? On one hand, we get quite the story of survival and, I suppose, adventure. We get near ethnographical descriptions of indigenous life in the American Southwest prior to full Spanish colonization. We see a blending of indigenous tradition and Spanish Catholicism in Cabeza de Vaca's faith healing. But I think something else to keep in mind here is that much of what information we do get from Cabeza de Vaca comes from a very particular lens. And we have to keep in mind that he wrote La Relación several years after his experiences. I have no doubt that Cabeza de Vaca experienced most, if not all, of what he claims to have happened to him and his compatriots. But we need to be critical, because we just don't know what's been exaggerated or embellished, particularly when it comes to his description of the native people. And I think there's something to be said about the importance of historical figures to certain regions as well. I grew up in Colorado, and I never heard of Cabeza de Vaca until my mentor Matt Andrews told me about him in North Carolina. And when I got to El Paso, Texas, all of my students already knew something of his story and looked at me weirdly when I was so excited by the novelty of Cabeza de Vaca's travels. So I guess it's fair to say that some footnotes are someone else's main texts, and some main texts are others' footnotes. Maybe that's obvious, maybe not, but it's a great outro for a podcast called Footnoting History. See you in the next one, folks. Thank you for listening to this episode of Footnoting History. We are on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Threads as @Footnoting History. We'd love to hear from you. Please consider joining our Patreons, and thank you if you're already a Patreon. We really appreciate your support. We hope to see you in the next episode, but until then, remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.